Hello, everyone, and welcome to Mind Your Mental. Just a reminder that this podcast is not meant to be a substitute for a relationship with a licensed mental health professional. I know they are hard to find, and I get that. I have a bunch of resources on my website if you need them, but I am not your clinician. I am a psychologist, but I am not your psychologist. So if you need any specific help, please look for the help of a licensed mental health professional. Learn all you can learn from the podcast. Enjoy the episode. Once again, we have Dr. William Parham. Well, how do you prefer to be referred? Because sometimes you sign your messages Dr. P.
A lot of people call me Dr. P out of for whatever reason. It's been going on for 20 years. So, I mean, however you call it's fine.
Okay.
Just don't call me late for dinner. That's all.
No, well, I will not.
Okay.
One of my questions is, the NBPA's Mental Health and Wellness Program was launched in response to the increasing demand for mental health resources. So how have you seen the mental health needs of professional athletes evolve since the program's inception in, I think it was 2018?
It was 2018. It was launched, it was announced in May of 2018. And I would want to back up a little bit, just some context. Mental health and wellness of elite athletes, and in this case, basketball players, has been necessary from the inception of basketball. This is not anything new. Fast forward just a little bit, the very logo of the NBA is a silhouette of Jerry West, now deceased, God rest his soul, beautiful man. But if you read his book, his memoir, entitled West on West, My Charmed, Tormented Life, he's a survivor of abuse. He's very candid about that, had not talked about it while he was alive. I did have a couple conversations with him about that, as well as many other things. But the very logo of the NBA is saying, you are a person, not just a performer. There have been many other players who we don't have a long time ago, it's about 50 or 60, that have made public news for years. But it's been sort of very sporadic. For the most part, it's been a good system and still is a good system. But what was happening at around 2015, 16, there are a number of players coming out in volume and very public about their very concerning struggles with mental health and wellness. Kevin Love, DeMar DeRozan, Kelly Oubre, a few others, even a couple of coaches. And so it was the concentration in a small period of time where the Players Association, which is the union basically, and that's very, very different than the NBA. We can get into that later maybe. But we had to listen to the voice of the players, or they did at the time. And so they got together and said, we have to have a mental health and wellness program. Because of my long-term association with the league, they had asked me to apply, and I applied and was selected as the founding director of the program. And I've been in that role since 2018. I think the needs are, with the players, are as they have been all along at one level. There's a lot of pressure because of the stigma of mental health and wellness. The world does not sort of give them permission to talk about it. And if you're a celebrity, if you're African American, if you're male, if you're a whole bunch of other things, we all are essentially incentivized to say nothing. Don't air the family linen. Keep everything secret. And because many of these transgressions happen when we're sub 10 years of age, we sort of want to be good boys and girls and daughters and sons and students and athletes, etc. And so we follow the code of silence. And we excel. And we distinguish ourselves, not only in athletics and academics, in our careers and relationships. We're pillars of the community, in our spiritual practice, in our community involvement, leadership, I should say, civic leadership. And so there's the evidence on the surface that all is well, and we got past all of that stuff. And it's not until things happen like COVID, where the world was shut down, and people couldn't go to work, couldn't go to restaurants, couldn't go to the gym, couldn't go get your nails and toes done, couldn't go to the show, couldn't go anywhere. And they realized that, well, our ability to go do those various and sundry things actually had two purposes, not one. We went there and felt satisfied, emotionally nourished, successful, accomplished, free from the daily grind, etc. That's a huge benefit. We learned that the biggest benefit, however, was we didn't have to focus in on our pain and all of that past trauma. And so when COVID hit and those literally all those options were shut down, the only room we had is the space between our ears. And that's when we started to think and recall, and just it got overwhelming. So I say all that to say a lot of players are carrying around a lot of stuff despite what it looks like on the surface. But also there are a lot of players, and the last point I'll make, a lot of players in mental health and wellness is not just when you're mentally ill or struggling. We actually see mental health and wellness in our program on a continuum from 1 to 10. And for example, players that are from, let's say, 8 to 10, they're actually doing substantially well. As an athlete, as a husband or spouse or partner, as a business person, as a person who's in philanthropy and doing quite well, who's a good parent, a good civic-minded person. Literally everything is going on, and they're very hopeful, have a good sense of agency. There are those from 4 to 7 who are doing basically well, but that may be an area or two in which they struggle a little bit more. And then there's those on a 1 to 3 who are struggling more mightily, let's say. And so our goal in our program is to really address wherever you are on the continuum. It's not about obtaining good mental health and wellness, it's how do you maintain it. So we use both those. But anyway, the needs are the same as they were, accentuated a little bit by things like COVID, social media. The latest report actually by the U.S. Surgeon General that was released in December of 2023, the title of which is Loneliness and Isolation. The essential theory there, concept is, despite the enormous, fabulous, creative, ingenious advances in communication, the world is still struggling with loneliness and isolation at epidemic proportions globally, not just domestically. And so that's an added context for today's athlete that we haven't yet got our head wrapped around. And the last thing that we haven't really understood is artificial intelligence. That's going to be another context. But anyway, I go on, I get too excited about all this stuff. But the need has always been there. It's still there. We're doing our best to respond to all the needs that have emerged and that will be emerging. So we're trying to get ahead of the gun. And so we're having fun doing it all.
Yeah, I love that aspect of having fun with it. I wanted to hone in on, I like the fact that you mentioned that you think of understanding mental health as a continuum. And I think previously, because I try to like research everyone really well, you've talked about reframing mental health as mental wealth. How do you guide athletes through the process of understanding mental health as a continuum so that it helps to shift the mindset in and outside of sports?
My approach has been to really capitalize on sort of 3 approaches. One is to not use words that we as professionals have been taught, the language of pathology. See, psychology in its history borrowed heavily from medicine, and medicine historically was rooted in the science of pathology, which is the study of disease. So a lot of the early concepts, formulations, conceptions within the field of psychology were rooted in what's wrong with you. And so I'm very intentional in not using a lot of that pathologizing language. As an example, words like antisocial, dysfunctional, aversive. I tend to not want to use those sorts of words, anxieties, depressions. I tend not to, again, use words like that unless I really need to. I use words, for example, like self-protection. If somebody is distant and avoiding, there's nothing wrong with them. Some experience has occurred in their life and their avoidance is their self-protective response so that they don't get hurt again. So I reframe people's experiences, not using, again, pathologized language. Um, but also, secondly, an additive to that, I realized something I mentioned earlier before the tape started rolling. If people come to me, athletes come to me, sometimes the first time they ever see me, they may have heard, read, but they don't really experience me. Yet they got along without me all these years. So I really underscore what I mentioned earlier. When I listen to my clients long enough, they will tell me what's wrong with them. When I listen to them just a little bit longer, they will tell me what I can do to make them feel better. So I really pride myself on listening to their story, because when I listen to their story, they have a decision about what they want to say, how far they want to go with their story. Am I really the person they want to say even more about the story to? And so they're making all those decisions. And so I think I'm very good at listening. In fact, one of my elders taught us a long time ago. If you look at the word listen and ask people, what does that really mean? Most people will give you a reasonable definition. Our elders taught us this. The key to maximizing what those 6 letters spell is hidden in those 6 letters. You see, if you move those letters around, you come up with the word silent. The best way to listen then is to be silent. The best way to listen to yourself, the best way to listen to others that you are providing services to, is to listen. They will tell you everything you need to know. So at best, we are facilitators, and I see myself as a facilitator. The third thing that I get to is, actually there's 4. The third thing is when it's appropriate. I see players talking about some pretty painful memories. And I really listen to what they're saying. I listen to the story part of it. But what I'm listening to with my second ear is how they responded to it. I help them discover that some of their source of their superpower really comes from not what happened to them, but how they responded to it. So the pain was a portal to them finding their purpose. So I like to reframe that. And related to that, where do you want to go? You were 6 years old when this thing happened. Now you're 26. People live until 90. So you have all this time left, 26 years of knowledge. How can you parlay that into something? The last thing, because they are in an industry where they are paid handsomely, it's important to get people to pay attention. So I use the concept of wealth in terms of the mental health and mental wealth. That gets their attention. When they realize they can tap into their wellness funds anytime they want to. So their confidence, motivation, self-esteem, all of that sense of agency, all of those are deposits that we are innately gifted with and we don't often call upon, but you can go to that ATM anytime you wish. So I speak like that, we talk like that with examples that come out of their own life. And when those dots connect, it makes a big difference. In fact, last thing I'll say, many athletes and people and patients I used to work with have what we all know are light bulb moments of insight. Now I get it, Dr. P. Well, I say, if you were to tell me that, Dr. Martin, I'd say, it's interesting you say you had a light bulb moment of insight. And I might go over to the wall and cut my lights off in the office and say, is it darker here? And you'd say, of course. And I cut the switch back on and I'll say, is it light now? You say, yeah. I would ask you, why is there light now in the room? And your first 2 answers are going to be wrong. First answer, I say that not because I'm arrogant, because this is what people do.
I understand. Yeah.
And the first answer most people come up with, well, Dr. P, you got the switch up. And I did. It's still the wrong answer. So then you're puzzled. What are you talking about? Oh, I know what you're trying to get at. There's electrical current in the room. I said, and there is. But that also is the wrong answer. So now you're really puzzled. Now, when I tell you what the real answer is, you know what your response is going to be? Duh. Why are you going to do it? Because you already knew. See, in order for their light to be now in the room, the light bulb had to be already plugged into the socket. That if you removed all the light bulbs and you still flick the switch up and you can verify electrical current running through the home, you're still going to be in the dark. So light bulb moments of insight have to mean that you were already pre-wired with that genius. But because of all the fog and noise in our lives, we don't often get access to it. So daily meditation, being silent, being reflective, is a portal to which to let some of that genius emerge.
Yeah, and I can see that you said like very many salient things, but one of the biggest things is I always tell my students and people I'm working with, like, don't use a $20 word when, like, a $1 word will do. Like it's just like nobody likes to be talked to like that. And honestly, it was one of the biggest things that bugged me during my PhD program. I would be like, you expect me to talk to my patient like this? Like this is what you think is going to help, and especially as someone who specializes and always wanted to specialize in Black mental health. You expect that to resonate with people that look like me. You expect me to say, well, the cognitive dissonance within you. I'm like, it's already hard enough to bring Black people to mental health, like in the first place. But then you want me to sound like an encyclopedia and expect them to open up to me? That's absurd.
Right. Right. But see, that's the arrogance of the professional of our history. And it's the promotion of the status quo.
Yeah.
And so I say that to say, because one of the things that has influenced me is I've deviated from a lot of what I've trained to do. Not deviated, but certainly have accentuated it. As a person who's been interested in martial arts for a long time, took up Kung Fu and now Tai Chi, there's a whole different philosophy that emerges. And when I compare and contrast at least those plus African philosophies, I began to say, well, there are different ways of looking at things. And it's like every crisis, for example, at one level is an opportunity. So anyway, I say all that to say, I think we have to think expansively and do what you do. Well, those big $20 words are not going to go over in some communities. And so how do you find not only a dollar word, but one that is more efficient and understood and captures the attention of the people you're purportedly wanting to serve?
Yeah, I think efficiency is incredibly important, and even just being concise. So when I'm teaching my students, and you're a professor as well, I mentioned like you will never get a paper over 3 pages from me because I don't understand why you need so much to share that thought. And one thing that I've also noticed in working, I mean, and this is a aspect of the time and pay inequities and health inequalities, we don't have that much time. Like it's amazing if I get a patient that looks like me who can come in every single week. But if they can't, I not only have to use this 50 minutes, but I have to give you some skills and techniques and maybe some prompts and some things that can carry you over to the next time I see you.
Right.
It's important to be concise. It's important to be able to break things down. Because when I was in training, since I worked with children as well, the thought process was, if you can't explain that term to a 4-year-old, you don't get it. And I've had patients as young as 4 where I've had to talk about the integration of feelings and thoughts and behaviors, the aspect of fairness and justice. Like if you can't break it down to a 4-year-old, you don't grasp it.
Right. You're intellectualizing and again promoting status quo, and that's just for me there's no place for that sort of fake promise that you're going to be better, because you are really participating in keeping them stuck.
Your leadership emphasizes treating the player as a person first and the athlete second. How has this philosophy shaped the way you approach mental health and wellness in high performance environments?
It has shaped it fundamentally. Actually, I was told again many, many years ago, probably when I was a teen, you can't take a U-Haul to heaven. And we were at a memorial service, and the elder was telling, as we provide, as you go to these professions, the procession from the church to the cemetery, how many times have you seen a U-Haul trailer attached to the hearse? And obviously, we thought it was a silly question, but the answer is nobody ever does. But where he was going with it, you can't take a U-Haul to heaven. So if that's true, which is code for it is, then what the heck are you on earth for? What is your purpose? What is your plan? And so early on, I started to really think about that, not fully grasping what was being told to me. But certainly as I got older, became a professional, it's all true. When I look at, for example, the statistics of any professional athlete, the average across sports, they're in their sport as a professional for 5 years, maybe. There's some who are clearly 15, 20, but that's an aberration. So the short-lived nature of their opportunity is real important. So you got to capitalize on what they have to do. And so you can't take any of this with you. So what else are you going to do? And I often refer to my grown-up years, heard a quote who I think is attributable to Mark Twain, but I don't know. But essentially the quote is, the two most important days in a person's life are the day they're born and the day they find out why. And so it's the purpose that has influenced how I approach players. Yeah, you can hoop phenomenally and you're getting paid handsomely for it. You love it. You've been loving it ever since you were 6 years old, out in your urban playground, even without a ball, but believing you had one, making that game-winning shot and hearing the fans just call your name. So you've had this in your sort of DNA for years. And long after you finish, you're going to remember all these pleasant memories. But life goes on after the fans stop cheering. And what are you going to do about all of that? You will always be a person. You'll never be a hooper. You hoop phenomenally. You'll be a phenomenal philanthropist and business person. But you're not a businessman. You're a person before a performer, in that case, business. And so I really elevate everything as personal. You have personal decisions, nuanced ways that you think about things, nuanced approaches and strategies that you developed, taken from many sources. But I also point out, I often ask athletes, how many fingerprints do you have on your finger? And they'll look at me like, what are you talking about? I say, yeah, just how many? And they get 10. I say, now which one of those 10 is identical to anybody in the world? And the answer is, of course, none. And I say, you know what that really means? The day you were born, they broke the mold. You can't be like anybody else, and they can never, ever be like you. And when you really get that into your DNA, you really have the freedom to discover the innate talents and genius that you were given. Now that's contrary because everybody wants you to be like Mike, be like so-and-so, et cetera, et cetera. And so because we want to be good, and honored and valued and visible, we follow the rules. But as long as you follow those rules, which aren't bad rules, because it gives you something to aspire to and good role modeling and all of that, you're missing the opportunity to discover the innate genius and superpowers you were given, as evidenced by your fingerprints. Nobody else is like you. So I use all of that in my work with athletes in explaining that their personhood is no accident. The pain and suffering that they've had to endure, and some of it absolutely positively feels like life happened to them. Ultimately, what athletes begin to discover is like, yeah, life happened to me, but maybe it also happened for me. Because it awakened me to a new reality, a new way of thinking, a new strategy, a new way to edit where I'm headed. And so I work in those spaces, really illuminating the person, because that's what's going to be the consistent thing until they get called home.
Yeah, I've always felt that when working with pretty high achieving people, a lot of times individuals get linked on this particular career. And I've always felt it to be more helpful just for your well-being as someone who believes in identifying your values and living according to those values, that it makes more sense to align with the mission, because your mission can very much change. Well, your mission will be the benchmark of who you are, and you can be in a different role, but your mission is still the same, right? Like my mission is to contribute to the longevity of the Black community through mental health and well-being. I can do that as a professor. I can do that as a scientist. I can do that through my own lineage as a mother. I can do that as an author, because just going to alter the role that I'm in to fit that mission. And I've always felt that the mission aspect of it makes more sense. And as someone who more so believes in like a value driven life, which helps me out a lot, because if it makes decision making easier. If it doesn't align with my values, it's going to be a smooth no. And if it does, and it's not ridiculously inconvenient, it's an easy yes. And I'm able to also make sure that the people around me and the environments around me are according to that too, because it's not only important for me to know what my values are, but when I see relationships starting to break down or sever or become more difficult, you have to reassess, like, is this person around me still aligned with the values that I have? Have I evolved? Have my values evolved? But I think when we think about it in terms of relationship and a mission, like you mentioned, instead of just like that one role, I really think it helps hiccups. Like with so many conversations lately, I've been having people about grief and relationships. You mentioned the aspect of needing silence at times, which can be really hard, especially for people who, they're good at their jobs. They're still humans. They get paid handsomely. They've lost their anonymity. And that silence piece can be a lot more difficult, especially with social media. Like, you walk somewhere and someone knows you before you know you, or they know the perception of you. And that really gets in the way of like mental health and well-being. Like I just want to go to Target.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you say something that's very important. We released a study a couple of years ago by FIFPRO, FIFPRO, the WNBA, and the NBPA. It was called social media abuse. You can look at it online. But the gist of it is that social media, relative to elite athletes, is abusive. And when you look at the category of LGBT African Americans, are the targets of a huge amount of that abuse. Mm. And it gets to a point of, even with these games and where the audience is playing on games and using essentially avatars as their players. Well, that translates sometimes going to an actual live game at an arena, talking to this player like he's an avatar, like he's not human.
Like he's not human.
And that does take a toll on athletes. And so when I mentioned earlier being silent, you are going to hear the noise and all of these distractions. But somewhere in there, particularly when it's guided, there's some healing, there's some truth, there's some things that merit exploration that can drown out all of that noise and contamination. But it has to be done, I think, skillfully. But players have to be taught how to launch that journey. Because again, they can't get lost in being silent. All of that tsunami wave of craziness sort of floods them, and they just avoid it. The silence is often guided and reflective. Because I often say also, a person will never see their reflection in running water. It is only when the water is still that a reflected image begins to emerge. And so stillness and being silent allows it to come up. But what comes up is all the noise on top of some of the healing energy. And it takes practice to learn how to have the healing energy emerge higher than some of the noise.
I can only imagine, this is totally off topic, but I can only imagine like what it's like in your classrooms or in sessions. Like it makes perfect sense that you enjoy Tai Chi. Like you're just very, very soothing, like voice, which I always feel like I don't have I remember going in school and they're talking about a therapeutic tone. And I'm just like, I don't think I I don't think I had that.
Well, my tagline and going through college, somebody gave me this tagline. It's called "Still Bill," and that's what still people get me. That's just how I roll because it's just part of my nature, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, and mine, I would. What is my? I don't think mine would be still. Like I think
It's excited.
Yes, I get excited about anything Black mental health. Just passion, persistence. My mom once said, "You are persistent and relentless." Like I truly pray for people who say no to you, because to you that's a maybe. My goodness, Raquel. And I'm like,
absolutely, and it's a blessing and it's a strength. It's a real strength because you're modeling. Yeah, the world has its challenges, but you don't have to let those challenges get inside of you, and that's important. And so you are really modeling joy and passion for what you do, and that's important.
I think so, because as someone who works in this realm and tries to focus on mental health and social justice, one thing that helps me is that there's no way to 100% know the future. You work with people and they're in this realm and they're dealing with oppression and bias and stereotypes, and of course you get exhausted and you get this aspect of internalized oppression. And I always say that like it starts as injected oppression first. It's not like we're going past all these positive messages and then we reach for the one negative one. No, we have to make it a point to focus on these things. So I'm like, there's no way to 100% know the future. There's no way for me to 100% know that it's going to get worse. There's no way to 100% know that this aspect of oppression is going to last forever. All I know is what I can control, what I can put out into the world, and kind of go from there. And it's not the aspect of blind optimism. If anything, that's more realistic, because it's unrealistic to think you can predict the future.
Exactly. In fact, you say that, and I tell my students all the time, how many of you in here have ever initiated anything, a relationship, whatever? And certainly everybody raises their hands, some people raise too. And I'll say, give me some examples. And they all do. They're excited about this. And then I look at them all and I said, now what if I were to invite you to consider, God forbid you believe what I say, but what if I were to invite you to consider that it's not humanly possible to initiate anything? They'll look at me like, what are you talking about? and I say, maybe like you are too, Dr. Martin, right now. I say, well, every thought that you've ever had, every feeling that you've ever experienced, and every behavior that you've ever executed, 100% of the time is in response to something that has already occurred. Your passion and excitement and creativity and strategic playing in terms of the realm of mental health for the Black community. You initiated a lot of things, this group you talked about and all that, at one level. At another fundamental level, those are all responses to what you saw was not there and desperately needed. I say all that to say, because we are always prided and talked about and reinforced and acknowledged for what we do and be proactive and initiate stuff, it robs us of really understanding what I believe is a fundamental truth. We don't get a good lesson and exercise and daily practice in our respondent skills. Everybody says it's not how many times you get knocked down, it's how many times you get up. Well, but they don't go deeper. And what does that really mean? You only control that you have. People have a little to no control over a lot that goes on in this world. But they have 100% control over how they respond to the challenges that the world presents. And there's three basic responses. Cognitive responses are how people think and process what's going on. Affective responses, the feelings that come forth as a result of what's going on. And behavioral responses, either doing something or doing nothing. Those are all respondent skills. And so really emphasizing how can you respond to XYZ challenge, both positive challenge, but also something that's very demanding and overwhelming. The bottom line is you have control over how you respond. So you're right, predicting the future, you don't know what's going to happen. You don't. And there's zero way to do it. I don't care how much equations and logarithms you put in there, you can't do it. It's just not going to happen. So why beat your head and try to do it? Focus on your respondent skills and things will improve substantially.
Yeah, I've always felt like, one of the things that working with patients is sometimes they try to, we can't control what our body perceives as a threat. We can only control our response to it. And sometimes people will come into session, they're like, no, I don't want my body, I don't want it to be perceived as a threat, because if it's not perceived as a threat, I don't have to work on my response. And I'm like, but you can't control, you can't, sometimes your body picks up stuff a memory that you're not even cognizant of, but and your olfactory senses pick something up. Like, you can't control what your body perceives as a threat. You can only control how you respond to that. It's kind of like so many people talk about boundaries, and a lot of people get it wrong. And because boundaries guide your behavior, rules attempt to dictate someone else's. So when someone is just like, oh, that person violated my boundary, and I said, oh, that's not possible. The only person who could violate your boundary is you. Boundaries are literally always going to be within your control, because it's always what you can control. You can only control yourself. Now, you may have given someone a rule that they violated, and like, okay, but rules aren't going to be as powerful because you can't fully control. I have 2 kids. I can't control. My goodness. I try to work on emotion regulation. I try to work on them understanding values and guiding their own behavior, because I know for a fact I can't listen. I need them to have an inherent, guiding principles within themselves, so they choose how they move themselves. But like anyone who's a parent, I'm like, how are those rules working out for you? I saw a clip of you recently on social media with, it was from the APA's page. I don't know if it was recent. My kids are young, so I can barely remember what I did yesterday or today. But you used a really good analogy of the aspect of dreaming, like in terms of athletes as dreamers. And I really gravitated to this for many reasons. One, as someone who focuses on Black mental health, one of the biggest concerns I have is like dehumanization. You talked about this briefly, about like the aspect of dehumanization, using these avatars, and dehumanization happens with Black people all the time. It's embedded in the history. We've never been rehumanized. And that dehumanization and adultification, because a lot of people come in young, takes away freedoms, like the freedom to dream. So I gravitated to it because of that. But also, I like the fact that you mentioned and I think I'm probably going to include a clip, because it was a very good clip. I saw it on my Facebook. But talking about the aspect of rediscovering your childlike freedom and creativity as important, even as high performing adults. You said something like, you've never met an athlete who didn't really envision this aspect of them being the NBA when they were playing, when they were young, when they were dribbling on urban playgrounds. They used that dream, and it inherently propelled them. So you mentioned that dreaming is like, it's just so important. How do you encourage elite athletes, or anyone for that matter, because you're also a professor, you also lead summits on these kind of things. How do you encourage them to reconnect with that sense of what I think is like uninhibited creativity and joy amidst the pressures of their profession?
Well, a principle that guides, one of the principles of several that guides me responding to what you're asking, I don't endorse the notion personally of teaching athletes or my students or patients I used to have I don't endorse the notion of reconnection, because reconnection assumes that they have disconnected and there's nothing there. I endorse the notion of this rediscovering that which already exists. The natural talent to dream is, again, we see it as kids, starting with playing house and playing whatever we play as in games as kids. That's dreaming. When I get to be an adult, here's what I want to do. Little girl playing with their dolls, or guys, whatever they're doing, that's dreaming. And then when they get old enough to really get, well, maybe I can hoop, maybe I can do X, Y, and Z, they dream even more. But what happens as we get into the world, in our elementary schools and our communities, become more literate about what's really, the influences are really impacting our lives, we are incentivized silently, in some cases not so silently, to squash the dream. Declare a major when you're a junior in college. Well, that makes some sense because you got to get focused and, whatever. But when you declare a major, you close that door on everything else. And you sort of quietly incentivized to not dream. So I remind players and students, let's dream again. One of the exercises I do in class, I tell students, if I right now wrote you a check for an amount of money that will last you and your next generation for the rest of their lives, you don't have to pay rent, mortgages, car notes, vacate. You don't have to pay tuitions, ain't nothing. You have a zillion, gazillion dollars right this second, verifiable. What would you do the rest of your life? Do you know over half of my students say they would be counselors and therapists? They go do philanthropy. They travel the world and serve others in these big, grand ways. So I conclude with, you're living now in a practical world, and I certainly support what you're doing, but don't ever lose sight of that. That dreaming is always a part of you, so much so you can't get rid of it. So much so, sometimes when you are sleeping and dreaming, what are you doing? Dreaming about the future, dreaming about where you can go. And so dreaming is a part. So I don't use the word disconnection at all. I use the word rediscover. And I get that from, if I had a bottle of water and this is full, it's not a trick question, and I turn over this glass and all the water falls out onto the floor, and now the glass is verifiably empty and the floor is soaking wet. If I were to ask you, Dr. Martin, why is the floor now wet? The first answer you're going to give me is wrong. Because you're going to say, well, you poured the water out on the floor. I say, yeah, I did. And the water's wet. And your second answer will be wrong. You say, well, because there's gravity. And there is. That's still the wrong answer. See, in order for the floor to be wet, there had to be liquid in the bottle in the first place. Because if there was no liquid in the bottle and I did this, what was going to come out? Nothing, because there's nothing there. So anytime something comes out of something, knowledge, wisdom, and an idea, a genius, a vision, it has to mean it's already in there. You just haven't put yourself around the appropriate stimuli to release that which is already there. So it goes back to a fundamental premise that I also have, which diverges substantially from psychology. We are all taught in psychology, probably even as an undergrad, this notion of tabula rasa, that when the baby is born, it comes out as a blank slate. Tabula rasa is Latin for blank slate. And that the idea of life and development is that as a kid grows older, he or she is given facts, figures, data, stuff to put into them so that they begin to fill up. And when they get to be about 18 to 20, they sort of have enough stuff in there to begin making some adult decisions about careers and relationships. But the gist of all developmental psychology is as you get to be 30, 40, 50, 60, you get to go up and up and you fill in the gaps and get wiser. Everybody believes that. I don't believe that whatsoever. Because when I really started to examine that fundamental premise, really drill down what that notion promises you, not suggests or hints. It promises you at no point in your life will you ever be fooled. Promises you. So you are the proverbial cat chasing your tail. Feeling bad, I'm not good enough, I'm not whatever enough, because you're forced to compare to others. And see, that's a Eurocentric way of framing what we're doing. Now, when I've studied, again, Eastern and other philosophies, fully 2/3 of the world believe something very different. They believe that when you are born, you have everything you need. In life, as a result of going through the same socialization, parents, family, community, church, spirit, the media, etc. The same things. Those are environments that stimulate out of you that which you already have. And when you believe, and when I believe that notion, every step along the way, you just have to discover the essence of who you are. See, we have developed languages, fill in the gaps, plug in the hole, come up to speed. And all of that assumes, okay, let's work harder. Let's pull ourselves up from our bootstraps and get it together. Well, that assumes you got boots on in the first place to lace up. That's a separate argument. But the fact is, anything comes out of anybody or anything has to mean it's already there. And so I use that as a fundamental premise. So I don't reconnect with anything. How do you rediscover the dream? And now that your career is winding down as a professional, let's envision the next 20 years. And the plus that you had when you were 6, you didn't have the emotional intelligence or cognitive sophistication to really do great things. Now you're 20 years down the road. You have 20 years more wisdom with the same level of freedom to dream and believe and see that which you want to do. So some athlete and the students always say, so Dr. Peterson, I could do any damn thing I want to do. I said, absolutely. Absolutely. So that's how I do, it's part of human. It's not a basketball thing. It's not a student thing. It's a human thing, but we've not been incentivized to dream, to be kids, to be curious. And I'm asking you to reconnect. Now, the facts are, you don't have to, because you already, by all markers of success, are exceeding expectations of success. So why fix something that's not broke? So you don't have to do it. Mm-hmm. But if you have achieved this level of success, carrying around that kind of baggage and stuff and contamination, it's scary to think how far you would go if you found a place to lay down that burden and begin healing and move forward. Absolutely scary. So maybe that's what your real issue is. You're afraid of discovering your innate genius and talents.
Well, I think that's an amazing prompt to end on if I ever heard one. Dr. Parham, thank you so much for coming to this show. I really wanted to focus on the integration of Black mental health and sports. I watch sports, but not as much as my husband. But I've gotten more and more interested over the years, the more I delve into focusing on Black mental health. And I'm always saying I'm going to be where the Black people are. And I'm like, well, how am I not learning more about the aspect of all of the mental wellness and education that you guys are doing within the sport? So I really appreciate you coming on the show. Do you do social media? I always say, tell the people where to find you. No. Well, they could catch you on the stage. You do summits and stuff like that. Do you have any kind of summit coming up soon?
Not, I just did, actually. I was in Harlem, actually, 2 weeks ago. There is a program Dr. Sidney Hankerson was a psychiatrist, was hosting the second annual Hope in Harlem Summit. So I was asked to be a speaker there. You can probably look it up already. I was also asked to speak. I'm on the governor here in California, the Governor's Advisory Council on physical fitness and mental wellness. And the California Senate had a hearing on play, sport, and movement, something you should also look up. It's a concept authored by Renata Simrell, another African-American female CEO of LA 84 Foundation, the foundation that was birthed after the 84 Olympics. She's authored the notion of play, sport, and movement. And you really should look her up and look more about her message. But anyway, we had a hearing at SoFi Stadium. And I was asked to be a panel on the importance of getting kids into recess, physical activity, structured competitions, early on in their life, because the data are not good. In some places, they don't have recess. In some places, they don't have mandatory physical education. And we're losing something and missed opportunity. So I have those sorts of things. I've done a number of podcasts, but I don't have my own social media for various reasons that I won't go into.
Okay.
But well, you were able to track me down, so I'm.
Oh yeah, listen. Every time people like, how did you find me? I'm a scientist. I research for a living. Okay, like I will find, and I always say people who don't have social media are probably the healthiest people out here. Like, I use it as a vessel to provide free psychoeducation and do stuff like this. But I'm also aware that there are some people who I'm like, well, the way you use it is not the way I use it. I think it would be helpful if you logged off for a little bit and help yourself. But thank you so much for coming on the show. Everyone, thanks for listening. As a reminder, be kind to yourself. 2 steps forward and 1 step back is still 1 step forward. That is just math. And have a good rest of your day.